Welcome everyone to AIGA Connecticut's Around the World series. Around the World is an open and ongoing conversation about the impact of underrepresented and marginalized communities in design. Our series aims to recognize, celebrate, and amplify a variety of perspectives, highlighting a different demographic monthly. Our conversation in November honors Native American Heritage Month and explores the professional paths of Indigenous artists and designers. Our panelists are notable for showcasing the influence of Native American artists, and their conversation will examine the ways we can approach design with a culturally sensitive and nuanced perspective. Throughout the conversation, please feel free to share your questions using the Q&A feature, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. But before we begin, we'd like to take a quick moment to thank Dr. Chip Thomas, who is an amazing muralist and photographer, and without whom this panel wouldn't be possible. So if you're out there, thanks, Chip. So without further ado, we'll turn the conversation over to Esther Berlin, the moderator of tonight's panel. And Esther is a Dene multimedia artist and writer, currently a faculty member in the low-res MFA program at the Institute for American Indian Arts, and she holds degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, the Institute of American Indian Arts, and Antioch University, Los Angeles. Her poetry collection, From the Belly of My Beauty, won the American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. Esther, so glad to have you. The floor is yours.
Yeah,
There you
Kira.
go.
Yat shidene edosh I am happy to be here, first of all, moderating this important discussion. With me today are 4 renowned artists who are helping to reshape narratives in design. And I'll take a moment to briefly introduce each of them. First, we have Greg Deal of the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, who is a provocative contemporary artist who challenges Western perceptions of Indigenous people, touching on issues of race, history, and stereotypes. Through his work, graphic design, paintings, murals, performance art, filmmaking, and spoken word, Deal critically examines issues and tells stories of decolonization and appropriation that affect Indian country. Welcome. Next is Nani Chicon, who is Dene and Chicana. She is most recognized as a painter and a muralist. She is born in Gallup, as I am, and grew up on both the Navajo Reservation and in New Mexico. Chicon's most notable works have been within the public arts sector, and she has a cumulative experience of over 20 years as an artist. And thank you for joining us, Nani. And then we have Sadie Redwing, a Lakota graphic designer and advocate from the Spirit Lake Nation of Fort Totten, North Dakota. And her research on cultural revitalization through design tools and strategies creates a new demand for tribal competence in graphic design research. Sadie, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. And then Chanupa Hanska Luger is a New Mexico-based multidisciplinary artist who uses social collaboration in response to timely and site-specific issues. Raised on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, he is Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Lakota, and of European descent. Again, glad to have you here. Super honored and humbled to be part of this collective of amazing Indigenous artists. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And we are just going to jump right into the questions. The first question, and well, I'll just let you go ahead and jump in. And if there's a little bit of a lag, I'll just kind of call on people to make sure things move along. So the first question, what are some guidelines we should establish when discussing the inclusion of Native American artists and art in larger communities? Who wants to start?
I can jump in and kind of give a little bit of context on where my answers may be coming from. So my name is Sadie Redwing. I work at the American Indian College Fund. My position really isn't an artist or a designer position, more of an advocate for Native American students in higher education spaces. So definitely kind of coming in with a higher education perspective. But I think in conversations of building curriculum specific to art and design schools, I think some of the guidelines that I know that I'm really vocal on is establishing greater terminology, especially when tackling words like, let's say, I still interact with folks who may not understand what the term visual sovereignty looks like, or even the term sovereignty. What does the term repatriation look like in the means of art and design? And right now I do a lot of tackling on the term decolonization and how that action is practiced, not as much as a metaphor, but actually demonstrating decolonization through design and design thinking to obtain greater land rights, or just looking to push greater inclusivity and ownership amongst space and community building. So definitely I'm really keen on getting these definitions and terminology down and kind of bridging some other terminology. And I know popular terminology includes appropriation, repatriation, and I'll end it at that for myself.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would also like to add just the experience of Indigenous people as, under this umbrella. If we're engaging with a community that's looking at a much broader application of design and stuff, it's also to read the room. Where are you located? What land are you on? Who is producing and making within that region? And how can you celebrate like each individual culture, the visual language that they maintain? And also let's look at contributions of stolen visual language applied to mass media and all of these sorts of things. I think it's important to empower us to see how we have already influenced and pushed those narratives forward. And where those things have been stolen, I think it's transparency. Let's start being honest with those experiences and conversations, particularly regionally, where you're at, where is your institution, where is your hub, where's your physical geographical location? We live there, we're from there. So yeah, heads up.
I agree with Chanupa that it's important to acknowledge the current aesthetics of the region that are being applied already. One of the things that I see as far as like Native American design goes is that there's a lot of blanketing of kind of stereotypical what that actually is. And even as an artist, I get asked to create work that is supposed to work like intertribally. And a lot of the times I have to take those precautions and that sensitivity because I know better. And because I have that sensitivity that because I'm Dene doesn't mean that I necessarily know what Lakota designs or what's appropriate to make something for Lakota people. So one of the things that I think is really important in laying groundwork is to source correct artists that are from those regions. Really, I'm always astonished on how I think one person kind of gets named an Indigenous artist and then all of a sudden they are the spokesperson for every single tribe. And that really shouldn't be the way it is. In every region, every land, there are Indigenous people, and we need to get away from the idea that there isn't, and that there are Indigenous people in the design field, in the education field, in public arts, in areas of government, and scholarly institutions. And we need to make the effort to find these people to correct stereotypes and basically blanketing of our cultures and our nations.
Yeah, I don't really know how to follow any of that, because I think everybody is just on point. And I know that Sadie has spent an enormous amount of time on this, specifically within the design realm. And that's some critical thinking that I think is just next level as a Native person, let alone, you know, the information that all of us should be sharing in the design world and in the greater art world as well. I think at a basic level, I do think that some sort of general recognition, because I mean, there's a lot of people I think that for the first time in their life are listening to the national discussion on race and equity, and they're starting to think a little more critically about marginalized groups that exist within these spaces, particularly in the West, and particularly with Native people. And so there just needs to be a basic acknowledgement of those things, heading down the rabbit hole. And more than anything, I think you need to allow Native people to speak. We need to tell our own stories. We don't need to be told what to do or how to do it. For the most part, most of us know, even though we are on some level also learning, you know, even I think where I was 10 years ago and where I am now are two different places. And so there's a progression that also is part of this. But I think it's just, you know, at a very basic level, you know, ask appropriate questions, make appropriate acknowledgements. Even if your acknowledgement is being that you don't know or you don't understand, I think that that's an okay place to start if you're admitting it to yourself, so that you can, we as Natives working with non-Natives can move forward in an appropriate way.
Yeah, thanks for that last comment, Greg. I think it's really important for people to be transparent about their entry points, and not just for the larger audiences, but even for a lot of Indigenous people that are reconnecting back to their tribe, or that are trying to reestablish that connection that's been lost for so many different reasons. And I think the next question really kind of blends into a lot of Sadie's research and her information, especially about the idea of appropriation, which was mentioned here, and how are we defining that? And I, from one of her talks, I'm going to kind of use this as an entryway here, is how is appropriation different from adaptation, or infusing, right? And so as underrepresented artists, and we might even be underrepresented within our own tribe, because Nani mentioned that too. Like, you know, when you talk about Dene artists, you know, like right away, like 3 or 4 pop up. And rather than, I think what we have been doing is creating collaborations. A lot of people have just been and you know, kind of doing solo work, and you know, we all feel the effect of that. So as for being underrepresented in a given field, it can be considered a liability or an obstacle. How are each of you in your own ways altering that perception? And can you share an experience of how art can increase that equity or that representation? Who wants to begin?
Yeah, I can just kind of trail out or add on to what you're saying, just in this idea of appropriation, adaptation, adoption, or infusion. And just a 30-second, or just quickly to kind of define kind of the appropriating is, you know, using of others without the actual acknowledgement or reference or citing to what it was, versus adapting where, you know, you're incorporating a practice, idea, resource, object into whatever it is that you're doing, but at least there's some acknowledgement or some citation or some reference of where the idea came from. Whereas infusion kind of goes into the line of kind of fusing two either identities, ideas together, and that might be a little bit more in a conversation for those who are maybe bi or multiracial in that sense, and trying to establish an identity with themselves. But I kind of want to speak on this idea of the lack of representation, because I feel like sometimes myself is I'm put in a position of how can we express greater representation across the board? And one of the I find myself in conversations with those who either one, they think Indigenous people don't exist, or even two, how can they start learning if they're lacking the resources? And I really express that as a designer or somebody who visually communicates, that is our job to give identity. And where are we lacking that identity? And amongst within Indigenous people is almost about everywhere. And sometimes if I'm speaking, let's say, if I'm speaking to you know, higher stakeholders at a university, and their question is, well, how can we increase, you know, more the Indigenous population? Or even too, if I get asked about questions on where I see the future of Native American graphic design, you know, I'll make a comment and say, it's like, well, if I'm a designer, I can't even go to a Native American fast food chain on my lunch break, or I can't drink a choke cherry Red Bull. Just even to, I can't go to Walmart and get porcupine quills, or if I'm a student, I live in the dorms and that university expects to do cultural events. Can I go to the bookstore and get beads? Or just even to having to paint this picture of what people cannot envision. And it's going to be the designer who brings that to life. And I think the easy, or not the easiest, but some of the more push on a reference is this idea of appropriation through food, and how much a designer, there are designers' roles within the grocery store, or even the hierarchy of food labeling. I think just even food labeling, or you know, what we can include, how many missed opportunities to educate, you know, indigeneity or visual sovereignty through the source of food is it's just insane. Like there's so, I mean, why aren't we educating with trade routes in the grocery store, with spices, or trades amongst crops? Or, you know, I always say, you know, you go to the deli, there's Italian bread, French bread, but why not Pueblo bread? Or just, you know, there's so much, you know, branding or advertisement, or just the organization of spaces created by designers that could incorporate into our everyday lives. And then just last little note, just even to like anything in your household, like I don't think that a lot of folks live in a home where their furniture comes from a Native American company or corporation, that goes with like even anything in your kitchen or within the towels. I mean, you might have souvenirs, but anything that we're exposed to in everyday life that's created by designer, there isn't much Indigenous reference. I'll end at that point.
I think that it's important to acknowledge that as designers and creative people, and being Indigenous, that we hold agency over our aesthetic, and whatever we create, whatever that may look like, however that is brought forward into the world, still holds as much Indigenous thought, whether it's rooted in traditionalism or not. And for some reason, that's sometimes a hard concept for people to understand, that no matter what I create, because I'm an Indigenous person, that comes from a unique perspective of my vision and my experience and the way that I see that aesthetic coming together for myself. As the idea of appropriation and adaptation, I think about this a lot, because I don't think that there's any reason why right now we need, in some ways, I think that appropriation in time was a means of survival for many, many people. And we learned to make weapons and food and all of these different kind of ideas that brought us out over into the world. And you always kind of hear people lean back on that excuse. But at this time and age, there's no reason why we can't source or credit or even find the direct sources for these inspirations or these adaptations within design, within food, within clothing, within anything. And I think that's very important, is to acknowledge the source. I think that that's something that leads to underrepresentation, is because when we do have these ideas that are inherently Indigenous being represented, we're being kind of forced out of that equation. And like maybe an example is, I'm just going to bring up, because we can pick on him, is like Kanye West. You know, he came up with these these glasses, right, which are like a complete ripoff of Inuit sunglasses. And of course, he gets called like a fashion genius. He gets called all of these things, but it is appropriation. Now it's that kind of, I guess, acceptance, or like acceptance into mass culture, where we get kind of cheated out of that conversation. And that's where that needs to stop, is with the acknowledgement of Indigenous people and our histories. Instead of them being objectified, we need to really look at Indigenous histories, our aesthetic, our culture, everything as major contributions to the way that everybody has survived up until now.
Yeah, I definitely piggyback on that, especially when we start talking about food. The movement of food that we've cultivated as a cultural technology, you know what I'm saying, has engineered and supported so much wealth development around the world, and we're not opening up that conversation in a way that gives any sort of acknowledgement. And I bring this up because there is a psychological effect of having all of your heroes be ghosts. You know, there's a psychological effect of not seeing anybody alive contributing to our current society. So like seeing those things on, you know, advertisements. I love the idea of trade routes exhibited in grocery stores, so people can really understand the direction and the movement of our food to our plate. You know, I like the idea of that, because I think that this is Indigenous knowledge that hasn't been shared and has been co-opted, and in the effort, it has undermined the experience of every human being on this planet, you know. And so you know, the acknowledgement of that, just from an economic standpoint, like corn, chocolate, tomatoes, squash. I mean, we can go down the list of your garbage Thanksgiving dinner, you know, coming up shortly, and really look at what you are doing is, you know, taking thanks. You know, you ain't giving thanks. You're benefiting and eating off of the plates of a technology and a labor of people who were here well before you, and have developed this sort of relationship with more than human species, a technology that's beautiful, you know, a technology that's going to help us survive into the future. And I think, you know, as far as a role of design is you know, mostly invisible but ever present, and so using that as leverage, as a tool to amplify our stories and our voices regionally and also internationally, I think would only make our cultures and community stronger. And for me, like, I want my children to be inspired by us in a way that is present and pervasive throughout, as much as it actually is. I want them to be able to see that and have a sense of pride, because it is psychologically like difficult to not see the contributions of your people in public, and there are health risks increased because of that.
That was amazing. Yeah, all of this I think points to this idea that so much of our identity and our existence is predicated upon the perception of others. That we don't get to own our identity, that our identity is ultimately thrust upon us, that we have to look a certain way, that we have to talk a certain way, we have to dress a certain way, that we have to live in a certain place in order to be, in order to be Indigenous. And the way that that overflows into design and art is we begin to see the way that all of these things have just been so just saturated our identity throughout American, if not Western culture, to the degree that we are fighting against trying to even have our own identity. Because I mean, in the United States, it's like 574 different tribes that are federally recognized, with several hundred more that aren't recognized federally, but maybe state or maybe not at all. And this continent is as diverse as the world that we live in. Different languages, different ideas, different textiles, different origin stories, different foods, different everything. And so we've been pigeonholed into this one single image, these one single, bits of pieces of design that have ultimately come to represent all of us. All you need to do is go to Southern Utah and just, it's what's his name? Oh, I just totally forgot his name. The Kokopelli is everywhere, it's just like, this is the stuff that has come to define everything about us. And then when you start to get into the design elements of this, I mean, one of the biggest sins against Indigenous people in the design world is papyrus. For heaven's sakes, stop using papyrus, for all of your typeface needs. And but all of this also comes to this strange place of being both visible and invisible, that we are here, but we are not here. I had been working in and around sort of the outdoor industry, and specifically the cycling industry. And a bike company sent me a bike, and it showed up and it has native iconography on the down tube as part of this thing. This is normal in the outdoor industry, because for some reason, when people think of outdoors, they think of native people, and it just snowballs into this thing. But the invisibility comes in where I have a very difficult conversation, where I have essentially like a white guide to take me through the back door to have this conversation with these people so I don't upset them, and to tell them what's what, and to do it in the nicest way possible, to only have them say, all right, well, thanks for telling us. We talked to our designer, and he said he's sorry. He grew up in Arizona, and we're just going to make new bikes. So there's no accountability. There's no accountability to the design. And even now, because this happened this summer, that even now in the national discussion, we're not finding the opportunities to find accountability and to help people along, which ultimately helps us. It helps employ designers, and people aren't interested in that. So it was Marin Bikes, if anyone's interested.
Well, I think we stumble into a huge a liability when we talk about underrepresentation, the erasure of Indigenous culture, right? Where we have, because it's been erased, a lot of people just resort to iconography and icons. And, when I think of appropriation, at least, my tribe, I think of all those Navajo women, the weavers, where their designs are, they're appropriated all over the place, and there really is not much they can do about it. A lot has been written about it. A lot has been, advocated against that kind of appropriation, but it still happens. And right now it's and that's probably why it was on some of those images are on bikes now. And you think of Pendleton, where they just take all of our designs, and so I think that's definitely one of the downsides. It affects our language, it affects who we are, and it affects how we see the world. So, and I really appreciate the conversation about food, the design into food. And also, it reminds me of designing the garden. There's a reason why we have the Three Sisters Garden. right? Because it creates that system that supports each other. And then we talk about trade routes. I'm over here in Durango, Colorado, and a major trade route ran through Durango. But even more, I'm more familiar in the Southwest, but all the trade routes between the Dene and the Pueblos and the Apache, and that's how all those feast days, that's all they did was trade. They trade for the next season. And so it is a collaborative effort. We create our palette, if you will, our lives around that design of whatever was in good season this year. So we had a garden, and we're in a high desert area, but it's also a mountain climate. So honestly, I never know what's going to grow in my garden. I mean, some years corn is great, some years squash is great, tomatoes are always really hard. So you kind of design your lifestyle based on what you can grow, what you can trade with, or who you can trade with. So thanks for all sharing that, the idea of how design changes our perspective and ultimately creates change, creates that that conversation, that vocabulary that Sadie mentioned earlier. And on the flip side, what are some of the barriers to design field for the design field for tribal and indigenous communities? From where you're at, or either getting into larger spheres of influence, if you will.
Yeah, I'm just gonna let the three large installation and mural artists answer that, because I think my biggest barriers is just having communication and cultural competency with like Western researchers. So I could go all night on that, but
Okay.
I'll add that 2 cents in.
Can you repeat it again?
Yeah. So what are some barriers of entry into the design field for tribal and or indigenous communities?
I would say, as far as coming from being an artist and kind of just breaking into being a full-time artist and having this be my profession and a job, it wasn't something to be a contemporary artist that was necessarily encouraged by my family or like my community. I don't want to say my family's supportive, but it wasn't like, oh, I want to be an artist. And it's like, do that. It's like, oh, are you sure? And I think because we're constantly thinking about sustainability and income and what it means to live in the Western world and have a job and all of these other things. There is also a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of institutional, I want to say, hurdles that you have to understand. And a lot of sometimes I sit on boards or panels to include other artists to be on a selection committee. And it's something that I continually advocate for is, are we providing the literacy for people to put in these proposals? Because there is so much like, and it's probably, Sadie can probably, this is probably the thing she was going to go off about is, that institutional competency. Are we only designing that? Are we only having that to uphold white supremacy? That is the barrier right there. Are we breaking that down enough so that way we are creating the entry point for the extremely talented, generationally talented artisans within our community, artists within our community? And also, are we making that space to think about Indigenous peoples as artists beyond the idea of being traditional, being only traditional artists? Like, am I taken seriously as an illustrator because I'm Dene and I'm not a rug weaver? You know, that's something that I think I've been asked numerous times, and no one in my family even weaves rugs, you know, but I am an artist, and I am Dene, and I think that we need to continue to push that and make sure that we are creating those spaces and questioning the spaces once we're in them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to just piggyback off of what Nani said. The greatest challenge I've experienced in relationship to creating work on an institutional level, and I imagine that's got to be the same in the field of design, is that I spend 75% of my time unpacking the work that I'm going to present. And so, you know, in relationship to the institution, I have to describe why and how the choices that I'm making are relevant to myself and the community, and how their effort isn't strong enough to describe our culture or community. And once again, it's on the labor of brown and bodies to like do that work for the institution. And after all of that unpacking, I got my fingers crossed, hoping that the work is good enough. You know, it describes to the people I want to reach, you know, that thing. But it's got so much bubble wrap on it, you know. It's got generations, centuries of this exchange, and that is a total concern that I have as well. Like, the institution is in the business of art as a noun, as an object, you know, and it's in the business of preserving culture, you know, and sheltering it and sequestering it in glass, you know. It's not in the business of maintaining it. That's us. That's what we do. We maintain culture. And that reference to traditional or contemporary is moot in the experience of a living culture, something that breathes and grows. The institution does it to its own culture, you know, isolates it, labels it, categorizes it by time and date. And to really look at something that's alive is to look at something living. And in that, I think that there is a responsibility that falls on all of our shoulders to present that work and to do that labor of unpacking all of that. And so, do we have access to the design world? Do we have access to the world of marketing and stuff like that? It's like, I want to have that question, but first I got to get all this bubble wrap off. You know, I got to unpack this thing so much that it's exhausting. You know, where everyone you see here is, you know, a couple generations into an apocalypse. You know, and it's amazing that we're not eating you. You know, because all of the apocalyptic movies I've seen, it falls apart that way. You know, and we've somehow survived it and thrived in that. And so seeing us. I charge you with the responsibility of doing that, you know, because I'm getting tired, you know, I'm getting tired of doing that work.
I think that, I mean, it's just so on point. But I also think you can, if you're able to look at everybody's work and the way that they're doing work, that everybody is really coming from a different place. The sort of visual vernacular of expressing our communities is just different. Like, my community doesn't base a whole lot on tradition. There are traditions, but there's other communities that are like really strong on their traditions, and my community really isn't. And so I have been feeding a lot on that in terms of creating something that is contemporary, that is here. I did a mural this summer, and the mural was like it's my daughter, and she's a member of our community, and she's wearing a band t-shirt, and she has a couple of references, subtle references to being a Native person, but this idea that like we can control how much people see and what they can see and what they perceive, because I think people want to be beaten over the head with like our identity. They want that to be just in their face, but at the same time, like when I started, I was told that my stuff was too Indigenous and that I needed to tone it down a little bit, and over time I've been able to sort of figure out what the balance is in that. But what I've been focusing on and where I've been finding some interesting success is like pointing at a living, breathing person and saying, this is Native, and that can be Native on its own, or even just the subtleties of, because my community does a lot of basket patterns and things that, like, some of those patterns can exist and be subtle and still be Indigenous. And so that's the struggle that I found, the barrier that I found, is like convincing people that no, this really is what it is. But at the same time, I have seen a progression to those things, which I think is pushed by each one of us in our own way, that we have to continue to grow and push, to sort of try to define those spaces for the next person, so that the next person doesn't have to try as hard and doesn't have to work as hard to convince anybody that they are also legitimate in their voice.
Exactly. I think sometimes when we're invited to sort of historically, antagonistic spaces, we're just so happy to be included, right? And sometimes we don't know how to ask for what we need or create those boundaries. I think Chinupa hit it. I mean, that spiritual, emotional labor that we have to exude almost every time we're invited to share our work is really, I mean, it's overwhelming. And I think that's a lot of the reason why I write. When I talk to people and I kind of say, well, have you read my work? Because, if we want to have an equitable conversation, we can only have one if we're coming at the same level. And we won't have that if I have to educate you for an hour and a half before we can actually talk. And it's so self-defeating, and it kind of also brings up too, when Nani was talking about resources and kind of funding and different spaces, not only are we on that level of competing with other people who might not understand our work, or we have to justify every single step in our work, but we're also dealing with people who are sort of cultural frauds, right? Sort of the people who are posing as Indigenous or coming in as, authentic or something else. And, so it's so much more complex because, we have to do so much battling before we even get a little bit of breathing space, or and we're constantly sort of maneuvering and manipulating space. So I appreciate all of your comments and just kind of letting our audience know that, so much of the labor and the energy that goes in before we even actually get to do what we're made to do, which is, the practice of art. And I appreciate, again, what Chinupa said, this idea, like, a lot of times we're coming in as sort of objects, where our art's objectified or we're objectified, and we really have to kind of animate out of that. And it's sometimes we can get stuck in a corner, and that can be really painful. So, and this kind of transitions into now telling us about a time where you either had to turn down a project because of conflicting cultural expectations about yourself or your art, or a time when you were able to guide the process to more appropriate expectations? So I'll say that again. So tell us about a time when you either had to turn down a project because of conflicting cultural expectations about yourself or your art, or a time when you were actually able to maneuver out of that, guide the process to more appropriate expectations.
Yeah, I'm one to turn down due to just being uncomfortable. If someone reaches out to me with a font project, logo project, or wanting to do some type of graphic imagery that's not in my region, I'm more comfortable working in visual languages that speak to the Great Plains region. But I noticed in this past year or so, there has been a lot of interest in the coastal form line design, or even to maybe researchers or folks in fashion. They want to have conversations about, and when I mean coastal, I mean the Northwest and Northeast, that we're working that form line design, or even in the Alaskan Arctic area. And it's just interesting to kind of, follow the trends, but I'm one that I will turn down a project, or if I, in that same response, I would offer maybe a contact to somebody of a designer that might be from that region. But I think that kind of goes along the lines of what everyone mentioned about being a designer from a specific region, or even to non-Indigenous cultural imagery, I turned down as well, just because I do have this inside fear of exploitation still. So and then kind of, learning how designs and symbolisms, iconography, however you want to say it, kind of maybe depicts is a recording device that depicts specific songs, prayers, stories, histories, you name it. There's still that fear in the exploitation. So I do my best to reach out if I'm unfamiliar with the project, or I respectfully decline.
Where I live in Colorado for the last 5 years, and something that I've noticed that is really difficult and disturbing is I guess a lot of I don't know, new age hippie types that just really want to pull in this indigenous thing, and they want to mix it with other things Eastern religions and things, and I understand from a certain point of view that it's coming from this place of wanting to be sort of aware and wanting to participate in this sort of perspective of what it's like to be in the West. It's like people go to Burning Man and then they're all about it. But that's turning those down has become like a weekend practice for me, because it happens a lot out here. And the level of disappointment that people get from that, as though I'm not participating in a way that they think I should be participating, which is interesting. But it took a long time for me as an artist and as a designer to even really just get used to doing that, because it's strangely confrontational to protect your own sense of identity as an artist or your identity as a Native person. And so it took a lot of time to sort of do that. I think so often Native people are, we're viewed as being this, great warrior, culture, or whatever you want to call it. But we're also in this strange position where we're expected to be agreeable to everything, and that we should somehow be excited about every opportunity, every crap opportunity that comes across. And that's just simply not the case. And I think you can see that unapologetic and even sometimes confrontational attitude coming out with artists now, because we're sick of it. It's exhausting and it's tiring, and we're not down anymore.
Thank you, Greg. That was me and Greg, I think, come from the same place in getting a lot of public work pieces. And with that, people sometimes have the idea ahead of time of what they want that space to look like. And I take my full agency to always shift that narrative. In fact, I think that that's actually the art of what I do. The product at the end is the byproduct of being able to have those tough conversations, of being able to create imagery that is thought-provoking and that isn't laying into any of these stereotypes of what Native spirituality or the Native experience should look like. Like I said before, because I am the one that's creating it, I have agency over what that aesthetic is, and that should be honored. The other part of it is that when one of the things that I do in almost every public work piece is that the work is site specific, that it's in conversation with the landscape, that it's in conversation with what is happening in the surroundings, that's incorporated into the work, and that there's also people within that landscape, within that community that are also collaborating on that work. So every public work piece I have is a collaborative piece. And I think that this is important because, again, it goes back to what the art piece is. The art piece, of course, at the end of the day becomes a mural, but more importantly, it's based in conversation and the continuation of that conversation. And how can I begin a conversation if I'm not including the people of the land to partake in that conversation with me from the beginning? So that is always not, you know, the producer's idea. You know, a lot of the times I get asked to, no, you know, we want to do something for Native American History Month. Come out and paint something, you know, and I have to explain to them my process. My process is not that simple. It's a lot more complex, and sometimes these things take time, and they take consideration, and they take collaboration, and they take conversation, and they take uncomfortable conversation, and it takes acknowledgement. It takes acknowledgement of the people who are there. So it's not always just this, you know, very convenient, easy thing to do. And when that part of my process can't be honored, I don't accept the invitation, because that is integral to the work. That's what makes the work for me. And if that is not there, I mean, they can hire somebody else really to do it. But for me, that's part of the process. And I think that that's what gives the work the integrity itself. And that's why I do it.
And then I accept the job that Nani puts down, and I just do all of that
so
work.
Many times.
Yeah, I'm your representative. I'm just putting that out there. No, but I mean that's some real stuff, though. I've been thinking a lot about that lately as well, just as a way to like reference, you know, the question. It's a project my partner Ginger Donnell and I have been working on for the last 2 years, which was called Settlement, and it was supposed to be a site-specific engagement in Plymouth, UK, and I totally turned down the initial ask. You know, when they first asked me to do it, I was like, nah, that's not my story. My peeps never saw a pilgrim. You know, like we didn't see those cats, you know, come off. But they, you know, kept pushing and kept asking. And I started to realize that, like, well, maybe this is an opportunity to look at the long-term effect of colonialism. This thing is embedded in a narrative that's 400, you know, this year is the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. And I'm like, who cares? You know, like, I'm not interested in that. However, there is a community that is, directly impacted by that narrative. There's the Wampanoag community that's, a part of this whole narrative. Why don't you ask them? And they were the organization that I was working with, the Wampanoag were a part of this like 4-nation effort to talk about the Mayflower 400th anniversary. And so I was like, well, okay, I can't be your one other representation, that's wrong. Like, that's not correct. I will stereotype myself in the process and in doing so affect the European perspective on Native people, even if what I do is outside of your expectation. And so I pushed them to do a couple of things. One, I was like, look, this can't be a spectacle. We've already come to Plymouth in that fashion. That's what, we can't bring that to you this time. And so I charged them with the responsibility of, rather than coming to view us as spectacle, to look at their own indigeneity. Like, I'm like, look, your folks have been here for a long time. You killed most of the people who were here before you, but some of them survived. There's a few of them that survived, and the culture and ideas survived. Look into that. Look into your own belonging to place, this place that is known as Great Britain, or whatever it was at the time of that relationship to the land that was held sacred. Look then, and then come and see us, and then suddenly we can intersect, rather than you gawk and see us as a spectacle. And in that process, I was like, look, I can't do this alone. I need to open and broaden the idea of what indigeneity is, just because in that European gaze, I don't know how many times I've gone over there and disappointed people for not looking the way that they wanted me to, and them having the boldness to question that, to tell me about their beadwork and teepees and their weekend adventures into a romantic Indigenous experience. And I've always been like, yeah, but Monday, I'm still Indigenous to North America, like I'm still a Native person on Monday and Tuesday and all of those other days. So this was an ask, and I tried to squeeze as much funding to support as many artists as I could for that project, to bring as much variety and representation, and really the trick, in all of this is, how do you develop complexity? We're viewed as one-dimensional entities, through that external lens, through that effort, even this effort right here, this effort to ask us on the month in which you can ask, is a part of that same thing, But what do we do with that? Once you're charged with that responsibility, what do you do? And the diversity that we're looking at is not nearly great enough. We have 2 Northern Plains, or 3. I don't know, Greg, do you guys consider yourself Northern Plains, or are you more kind of like mountain peeps?
Plateau.
Great Basin, maybe lightly related to Southwest. Yeah. This is one small group into that much larger conversation, so like that was one point where I tried to flex the privilege that I have as an artist, and to challenge the expectations of the space, after I tried to say no, like what do you do in response to that, when no isn't good enough, and you have to do something. It's like, how do you move that even further into that conversation? And I wanted to bring everyone I could, I was like, please, but I was limited by the amount of money that I had, and then also representation of who are the bodies I'm going to bring. I had to look at like gender politics and identity and all of that sort of stuff in relationship to developing a demographic to share with a European audience that's hungry just to consume it. I'm like, and I had to think about protection for that as well. Like, how do we make ourselves safe in that space? These are all challenges, and yeah, it's weird. It's super weird.
I want to make a comment really quick. She just reminded me of something. Chinupa is one project at the College Fund that we really struggled with is one of our donors who donates, funding to help with scholarships wanted to do some type of promotional material to honor the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. And I kind of got brought on into that conversation, and something that I think people forget is being from the Midwest, that the Mayflower and Columbus isn't necessarily our history. So I didn't have much input on how that idea goes, but I think in this idea of needing to deconstruct this concept of time, and a comment that I made that Chinupa made me think about is, one of the reasons why we don't know much of that Mayflower history is because those covered wagons, they weren't Lamborghinis, like they didn't make it to South Dakota that fast. So we did have that 200 years times, post like Louisiana Purchase or anything. But I guess the point is this idea of one, the struggles of, developing promo or branding materials for a concept like celebrating the 400th of the Mayflower or the whole Plymouth Rock, or even getting into Thanksgiving now that we're in the month. And that was a project that really struggled with, and I don't foresee in us, if that project were to come, if a similar project were to come our way, I think I would probably one, need to do a little bit of research, or two, it wouldn't be something we'd pick up like that, understanding this experience we had this year.
Yeah, I would also like to add, like, I got in trouble for doing this project from Wampanoag Community because my intersection, my coordinator in the UK, told me that they had that conversation, and I didn't do it. I didn't open up that dialogue and talk to the Wampanoag community directly, and it got that lateral kind of exchange became a real thing, and I physically went out to the East Coast and met with the board that was representatives for the Wampanoag Nation in relationship to Mayflower 400 to try to remedy that, because that's some real stuff. Like I never really thought about how toxic the project would be as a point of their own celebration and their own experience, within that space. So even to say, yeah, colonialism has affected us all, also takes away from a time and experience where everyone's eyes should be on Wampanoag, and their story. And I didn't think about that, but simultaneously, because that's not my story. You know what I'm saying? Like, I can't tell your Wampanoag story. Like, I'm Northern Plains. Like, it's a different place. I live in New Mexico now, and this is a different place from where I'm from, and just like all of those different kind of, I mean, as Greg was talking about the spirituality kind of aspect, like where I'm from, it's genuine, hardcore, ugly, vicious racism, and when I moved to New Mexico, I was like blown away by the marginalization through like romantic gaze, and I'm like, God, I'm supposed to punch you right now. Like, the normal thing I remember is hitting you, but you want to touch my hair and tell me about your mushroom trip because somehow that's like a spiritual connection to the land, It's interesting how regionally all of that stuff plays out in different ways,
Yeah. Woo! Well, we have had a great hour of conversation. It's been very provocative, and I think we've left our audience with a lot of things to consider. So because we're out of time, we won't be able to do any Q&A, but I'm sure Kira has information to everybody's contact to follow up and to continue conversations on, and even as consulting. I mean, I know a lot of times, when you go in as the artist, you become more, you're like the cultural expert, consultant, spiritual leader, designer as well. And I think that all kind of came out as we opened this conversation up. And a few takeaways are this conversation should be continuous. We should definitely bring in some common language around it, and it needs to be larger. And I think right now we're already doing a pretty decent job of collaboration. I think a lot of people now are really kind of saying some of these efforts that you want, this space you want me to fill, this void, is too large for one person. I mean, we really need to bring in groups of people to do it justice and to serve and honor our heritage. Again, you know, this Native Heritage Month, I'm sure your calendar, everyone here's calendar is probably super busy, as is mine, because all of a sudden people are wanting to, you know, have these conversations, and they are difficult, they are hard. And I think everybody here did an amazing job. And one thing I do want to leave us with is the fact that we're able to have these conversations without like a ton of emotion or a ton of difficulty is because we've walked through a lot. You know, speaking to audiences like this, talking about it, we've had to do our own healing. We've had to do our own and that's really what it is, our own healing, our own education in order to share. You know, we have to put ourselves in a healthy and safe space in order to give extra, because, you know, we're all dealing with our own family issues, our own tribal issues, and our own individual art kind of places here in development. So I appreciate all of you sharing that work, because, and I want to emphasize that to everyone else. So when tribal people come up here and they're able to talk in an articulate way, intelligible way, it's because we've walked the long, hard walk of doing the hard work already in our own lives. And we've gotten help from other people in order to be in the space we're at. So I think that's super important. And I think I just hand it off to Kira from here.
Sure, I'll take it. Thank you.
Okay.
This was so dope. I have like a running notebook full of notes. This was amazing. I love the conversation. Thank you for the real talk. We did have a little bit of an ask to you all at the beginning that we have an unfiltered conversation, and you absolutely delivered. So thank you on behalf of AIGA Connecticut for this. For the rest of our community, you know, definitely head over to AIGA CT on Instagram to see the work from our wonderful panelists. We'll have a recording of this conversation, and you can also interact with other people, folks from design and the design community. And definitely, speaking of community, please join AIGA Connecticut's public Slack workplace. You can visit our website at connecticut.aiga.org. Go right to get involved in the navigation and select join our public Slack. And feel free to share your thoughts about this session and any other programming you'd like to see. We really appreciate everyone's time, and we hope you all have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.